All right, tonight we're going to talk about measuring the economy. In other words, how do we sit here and say the economy is doing well, the economy is doing poor? How do we know where the economy really is? And so we use a couple of different tools to tell growth. Remember, if we think back to those 6 broad social goals of the economy, one of the important goals to people who favor capitalism is growth. The simple idea is as the economy grows, there's more for everyone. If there's a bigger pie, each individual gets a bigger slice, assuming that everyone gets a share in it. And that's where we end up with some of the arguments. The main thing we use to measure growth is something called GDP. Gross, which means total, domestic, which means within our country, product. In other words, how much we produce. What this does is measures the entire level of the U.S. economy. There are 4 components that we measure. So in other words, we break down everything that's new that we produce in this country and we add it up and say this is how much we made. Almost like a measure of our country's income at the end of the year. How much did all 310 million people in this country plus the government produce? The first is consumer spending. And this makes up the majority. The goal is to have this to be between 70 and 80% of the economy. In other words, every time you go to Best Buy or Walmart or Target or McDonald's, you are participating in consumer spending. Anytime you buy something that's new. Things that are not new do not count. For example, if you go to a garage sale and you buy something, we do not count that in our gross domestic product. The second is business investment. Businesses don't spend, they invest. For example, what businesses do is go out and buy a new forklift. That's not considered spending, that's considered investing. And we track that. It allows us to separate out our businesses being optimistic. We want business spending to increase, business investing to increase because businesses look long term. In other words, businesses make decisions based on what they think will happen in the future. So what we want to see is that businesses are optimistic about the future. The third is government spending. So spending for military, wages, road construction, all of those kind of things. And the fourth one is net exports. Net means, think of net like profit. If you're going to make a cheeseburger and it costs $5 to make it, and you charge $6, your profit is $1. Net exports take into account how much we send to other countries and how much do we take in from other countries. Now, we can talk about real GDP as well. And this is important because remember we talk about inflation. So we want to look at, is our country improving, being more productive, is our economy growing or not? And one of the mistakes is when we talk about inflation, are we really making more? In other words, if you raise the price, it looks like on paper that you've got more money. But if you raise the price 10% and the amount that's produced goes down, you really haven't grown. You're just charging more for it. So real GDP is more important or more accurate because it takes into account the fact that prices will increase or decrease over time. So therefore, this is more accurate. Now, we talk about the business cycle, and really what we're talking about now with the government is the government tries to have kind of this Goldilocks economy. Remember Goldilocks and the 3 bears? The idea is that the porridge is not too hot or not too cold. And so we talk about a natural economy will have cycles of boom and bust. In other words, those recessions, expansions, peaks, and contractions. What we want to have is something that kind of cuts off the tops and the bottoms. We want to lessen the impact of a recession. We know we're going to have recessions, but can we make it a soft landing? Can we make sure that it's not nearly as destructive for people? The first way we can try and do this is called fiscal policy. Fiscal policy deals with using the amount of money that the government spends or how much it takes from people in tax policies. In other words, if the economy is going really, really well and we think it's getting too big, it's a bubble about to pop, well, what they can do is the government can stop spending money or it can raise taxes. If we raise taxes, individuals and businesses have less money to spend, and therefore the economy will slow down. That's not usually what happens. Fiscal policy is mostly employed when the economy is doing bad. This is what the Paul Krugmans from the New York Times advocates. This is the Keynesian School of Economics. This is what Barack Obama really advocates. The idea that, people don't have jobs, businesses aren't investing, consumers aren't spending, so the only people left are the government to spend money to increase productivity. This is, again, what Obama's advocating. Now, doesn't mean he's right, doesn't mean he's wrong. That's one school of thought. One of the things you have to understand about economics is that people, intelligent people who have researched, completely disagree. Contrary to what a teacher accused me of the other day, it is not a black and white subject. People on each side think it's black and white, but there's a lot of gray because there are so many factors. It is such a complex thing. Second option is monetary policy. In other words, controlling the supply of money and interest rates. So here's how it works. People are spending too much money. What we can do is take money out of circulation. Remember how if I spend $1 at the school store gives that $1 to the worker goes to McDonald's and buys a cheeseburger. McDonald's takes that $1 and gives it to the employee, who goes to Best Buy or goes to iTunes and buys a song. iTunes gives that money to a musician, and you see how it cycles. If we have less money, it can't circulate as well. Think back to the game we played where we started with $1,000 and we created all those jobs because of interest rates, how much I was giving and how much I was charging, and how much money was in there. If the initial investor only had $500, we create less economic activity. This is considered more like what Ronald Reagan did. Now, none of you have any clue who Ronald Reagan really is, but what we need to understand is that in modern politics, the Democrats and Republicans have kind of like their heroes, kind of the people they look up to and say, this person did it right. For Republicans, it would be Reagan. For Democrats, it would be Franklin Delano Roosevelt. And I'm not going to go into all of that stuff. Again, what we see is this business cycle with all of these ups and downs. And the goal for both policies, fiscal or monetary, is the same: to cut off the tops so it's not so high, and to cut off the bottoms so it doesn't get so low. So we don't see these wild swings in wealth, because what happens is at some point economics stops being about money and it starts being about psychology. In a lot of cases, what happens is fear will drive markets. People become afraid. If you think you're going to lose your job, you're not going to spend money. If you think things are getting worse, you're not going to invest. And so what we want to do is have it pretty steady up and down with long-term growth. The second category our government talks about, and that we see in the paper all the time, is unemployment. This is our unemployment rate on the right. This chart shows the percent of people who are considered unemployed from 1998 to 2009, and we see a couple of spikes. We see it shoot up in 2001. What caused that, really? I'm hoping you're saying a combination of the dot-com bust and the attacks on 9/11. And the second thing that we see is just an absolute gigantic spike up at 2008. I really should get a new one on here to show how high it climbed after 2008, because we still aren't down to where it was in 2008. We are at almost double where it was in 1998. Unemployment is a little bit tricky because it only counts the percentage of people in America who, number one, want a job. If you are a stay-at-home mother, you are not unemployed. Trust me, you work harder than most people who have a job, but you are not unemployed. Second, you have to be looking for a job. If you are a teenager living at your parents' house and don't have a job, but you want a job, but you never go out and fill out an application, you are not unemployed. You are lazy. Third, you cannot find a job. So as soon as you want a job, are looking for a job, and somebody offers you a job, you're not unemployed anymore. So the hard thing is legally, let's say you get laid off as a manager at a company and somebody offers you a job as a salesperson. Technically, you're not unemployed anymore because you had a job offer. Now, what happens is people don't report that they had that job. Once they're on unemployment, what they'll do is they will just simply say, well, all right, that one doesn't count, and they're not going to report it. What happens with the business cycle and unemployment? We should remember this from our previous lectures. During a recession, we have an increase in unemployment, always, because companies are going to lay people off. Because again, if we look at the factors of production, the most expensive part of any business is is labor. So if you need to cut costs, the first thing you need to do is cut the easiest things, which is labor. In an expansion, we have a decrease in unemployment. So that's good. Currently, our unemployment is around 8.0%. In some parts of the country, it is much, much worse. Detroit is held up as one of the worst, with a current unemployment at 22.2%. Remember, that's not the total people who don't have jobs. That's the percentage of people who want a job, are looking for a job, and can't find a job. It doesn't count the people who have given up work or who are working at a lower paying, lower hours job. Now, the third thing we have to talk about that deals with growth is prices or inflation. Remember, money today does not equal money yesterday. When you hear your grandfather say stupid things like, oh, when I was back in my day, I bought my first house for $16,000. Wonderful. Here's the problem with that. You didn't pay today's $16,000. When you paid $16,000 for your house back then, you made $1 a day, $2 a day, those kind of things. This is, again, inflation. The idea that there is a sustained increase in prices over time. Prices will go up and not come back down. It's not like seasonal things where, for example, roses get really, really expensive on Valentine's Day because a bunch of people are stupid and think a rose says it loves you. A rose says, this is a symbol of my love. Because if it really meant that, stop and think of what you're saying. Here's something overpriced that will die very, very shortly, just like our love. That's why I don't buy roses. That and I'm cheap. Inflation is not like roses at Valentine's Day. Inflation is the fact that your prices will go up and will not come back down. It helps some people and hurts others. This is why you need to understand money. Inflation, for me, should be very good. That's the goal. It should be very good as long as it's controlled inflation. We measure inflation by looking at what's called the CPI, or the Consumer Price Index. This is where the government takes a look at 400 very common products: eggs, milk, cheese, bread, gas, electricity, things that are very, very normal products that the average person buys. Then they compare those prices to where they were last quarter, last month, last year, whatever the case may be. Remember, as inflation increases, the value of each dollar decreases. So when inflation goes up, your money gets less valuable. Well, how does it help people or how does it hurt people? How does small inflation help most Americans? This is why we went off of the gold standard, the idea that we wanted to be able to set and control inflation. That's why money isn't backed up. Well, that and a variety of other reasons why money isn't backed up with gold. Number one, let's look at Mr. Colvin buying a house. If my income today is $2,000 a month, in other words, I make $35,000 a year. When I made this PowerPoint, that's what I made. That's when I bought my house. My mortgage was $1,100 a month. Ouch, that hurts. That means after paying for just my mortgage, none of my other bills, I only have $900 a month left over. That's not very good. In fact, you're not going to get a loan if that's your debt to income ratio, which we'll talk about in our next unit. If we have a set inflation of 3% per year, here's what we see. In 10 years, assuming I get a raise at the rate of inflation, and I get $3,000 a month, in other words, $52,000 a year. Now, that means all of my other prices have gone up, but my mortgage stays the same because I bought a 30-year fixed mortgage. My mortgage payment is $1,100 a month, and it will never go up, which means in 10 years, my mortgage isn't more than half of my income. It's slightly more than a third. I still have the same house, but the cost has gone down. In 20 years, assuming I get 3% raises every year, I will be making $77,000 a year. My income is $4,500. Now my mortgage is less than 25% of my income. So in year one, my house costs more than 50% of every dollar I make. In 20 years, my mortgage will cost less than 25 cents of every dollar I make. In 30 years, and this is the goal, I stayed in the same house. In 30 years, I make $6,600 a month, or $114,000 a year. My mortgage now is less, or is 1/6 of my income. My house gets cheaper every single year because of inflation. I want small controlled inflation, but the key is you have to understand money in order to take advantage of this. Have a good night.